This week we start on our first chapter in Access. So the project we'll be completing is Challenge Yourself 5.4, and this will cover advanced tables and queries. So the scenario for this project is that we're working on a database for a worldwide health organization. And we'll do some modifications to tables to ensure consistent data entry and prevent data errors. So the first thing you need to do is download the start file, and I have mine on the screen. And so notice that we have the two banners. In the previous applications we've only had the enable content. Well, this time we need to save it first. So I'll go ahead and click on save, and you'll want to save it to wherever you typically save your documents. I'm saving mine to my desktop, and then you can enable content. So we'll jump into step 3, and this step tells us that the locations table lists the organization's locations around the world. So we want to open the locations table and make the following changes. So just as a refresher, to quickly open a table, we can double click it. And when we open a table in Access, by default it opens in Datasheet view. Well, if we want to make modifications to it, we want to switch to Design View. So I'll go ahead and select Design View. And the first thing it's asking us to do is to add an input mask. So this step is a little challenging, and you have to actually be a little bit familiar with input masks. So we want to add that input mask to the location ID field. So we do need to have that as our active cell. So you can activate that cell just by clicking in it. And notice down here at the bottom of the window, you have field properties. So anytime we're making changes to a field, typically we will use this field properties area, and we want to add the input mask. If you notice over to the right, we have the tool for the wizard, and so this is the input mask wizard. So by default, Access has recognized some common input masks items that that data users typically would use. Well, we want to create an input mask that is not in this default list. So I'll go ahead and cancel this. And I'm going to refer to the textbook. Let me pull it over here. So if when you open up your file, if you want to look at the textbook, you can click on Library, and we want to make sure we're looking in this Access textbook and Access 2016. And notice when we get to Chapter 5, there's a unit 5.4, creating a custom input mask. So this is what we're doing for this step. We're creating a custom. And here is a list of placeholder characters that helps us define the data entry rules for our input mask. So the instruction tells us that we want to require 3 letters. So if we look down this list, L means that a letter is required. So if we want to require 3 letters, we need 3 L's. The next thing is we want to have 1 required number. So a digit is a number, so any digit required. So we want to have a 0 following our 3 L's. The next thing it tells us is that we want 2 additional optional numbers. So we can see here that 9 is an any digit optional number. So that means we want 3 L's, a 0, 9, 9. And then following that, this tells us to create a custom input mask. We've entered our input mask, our characters, and then we need to follow those by a semicolon. And then it tells us if you want to add literal characters to be stored in the database, type a 0. Well, it doesn't tell us we want that. If not, just type the semicolon. So that means we need to have 2 semicolons after our input mask. And then the instruction tells us that we want we want to use the underscore character as the data entry placeholder character. So that means we need 3Ls 099 colon or semicolon semicolon underscore. So let me jump back to my database, and I'll put that input mask in, and we want to type it exactly as it is in the list. So semicolon semicolon, and then we want to put in that underscore. Now this is just going to anyone who's entering data now. That's the only characters they can put into this into this field in each record. So okay. So the next thing we want to do is modify the lookup field properties for the location type. So if we want to make a change to location type, we need to click in that cell. And then we want to, and it tells us we want to modify the lookup field properties. So when we come back down here to field properties, we want to click on the lookup tab. And we want to limit to list. We can use that drop down arrow, change it to yes. The next thing it tells us is we want to modify the lookup field properties for the location type field to allow multiple values. So right below that is allow multiple values, and we simply want to change that to yes as well. Now we automatically get this pop-up, and this is just warning us that that things will change with this. So we say yes. All right. And so the next thing it wants us to do is hide the patient average field so that it is hidden in datasheet view. So remember, right now we're in design view, so we need to switch to datasheet view to hide the patient average. So first, when I try to switch views, it tells me I need to save my table first. So I'm just going to click yes. Now I'm in datasheet view, and to hide that patient average, I'm just going to click on the column, right click, and just simply click hide fields. Okay, so the column's still there, it's just not visible to someone that may be entering records. All right, so now it tells us to save and close. So we can just go ahead and close, and it'll give us a pop-up to save it, or you can hit save and then close. All right, so step 4, it wants us to open the shipments table and make the following changes. So I'm coming back over here to my all access objects window, and I'm going to double click shipments to open it. And the first thing it wants us to do is add a calculated field named lost to the far right side of the shipments table to calculate the number of units lost for each shipment. So we're adding a field, so we need a column to this table. So we can come over to right after quantity received, the next available column, click to add. So I'll click that button and get the list of options, and we want to add that calculated field. So we know we're looking for a numeric value, so we want to choose number. And so we get the expression builder. So this is going to help us build our expression that we want to create here, and it tells us in the instructions. We want to subtract quantity shipped. We want to subtract quantity received from quantity shipped. So we can manually type that in and enclose it in the brackets. It tells us what it should look like. Or since we have a list of the fields in our table here, we can just double click those, and that'll move it up there in our expression for us. Now we just have to put whatever we want it to do. So in this case, we want to subtract. And then we want to subtract the quantity received, so I'll double click it. And there we go, we have our expression. So I'm just clicking OK, and notice it completed the task here for us. So you can just kind of check it real quick on this first one. 500 minus 498 should be 2. So we have the result we were looking for. And then real quick, the field 1 is highlighted. We want to change that name to loss. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is display the total row. So to display the total row, I'm going to click out of my loss field. And I'm just going to click down here at the bottom, the next blank record. And in the table tools, records, or I'm sorry, on the home tab in the records group, I'm just going to click totals. And that puts the totals line in for us. So right above it, we could still add new records, and below it, it'll just keep a running total for us. So we want to know the sum for both quantity shipped and quantity received. So if I click on the blank cell below quantity shipped, I can choose sum, and same thing under quantity received. Okay, so now it wants us to add a field validation rule to the quantity shipped field to require entry to be greater or equal to 12. So for us to do this, we actually need to switch to design view. So I am going to change from datasheet view to design view. And we know we want to add this validation rule to quantity shipped, so I need to click that field. And if we're adding a validation rule, we need to, in the field properties, we need to find validation rule. And then we just kind of have to think about what it's asking us to do. I mean, we could use the expression builder over here to the right, or since this one's a pretty simple one, we can just type this one in. We just need to type in greater than or equal to 12. So I'm going to put in the greater than equal to 12 in the validation rule. And then just to explain to whomever's entering data, we're going to put text to support that. And that text is, new shipments must contain at least 12 units. And just make sure you type it exactly as it is in the instructions and spell everything correctly. All right, after we've completed that step, it wants us to add a record validation. So this time we added a field validation. Now we want to add a record validation. And we want to do it for the date received field. So I'm going to click on the date received field name, and this time I'm going to use the property sheet since we're actually updating the record. We're doing a record validation. So if your property sheet wasn't automatically visible, you can actually go to Table Tools Design tab and click on Property Sheet. Then you have access to update that information. So in the validation rule, we want to type in, or we want our rule to be that the date received is greater than the date shipped, because it's asking us to require a rule where the date received field to be after the date and the date shipped. So you kind of have to think about it. So it should read date received greater than date shipped. So this time I will use the expression builder, and I am going to click on date received, or I could type it in, and then I'm putting in that greater than symbol, and then I want to click on date shipped and OK, and that puts it in this validation rule for us. And then we can just give an explanation for that one as well. So date received must be after date shipped. So that way whomever's entering the data knows what's going on with that rule. Now we can just simply save and close this table. And we did have a hint up in step D that said allow data violations. So we just want to go ahead and click yes and yes. And now we can close this table. All right, now we want to create an update query to update the comments field for all patients who have had flu shots. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go to the Create tab, and we could create a query either using the Query Wizard or the Query Design. For this first one, I'll just do Query Wizard. So I'm just going to choose Simple Query Wizard, and I'm going to base it on the diagnosis table, and I want to select all fields. And then I'm going to click Next. I want to show all the details, Next. And we want to call this query Update Flu Shot Comments. So I'm going to type that in. and then I'm going to click Finish. So I have this query, but we want to make a couple of changes to this. So we want to switch to, we want to go to the Home tab, and we want to change that view from Datasheet View to Design View. Now we can see all of our fields here, and we can put some criteria in. So under the diagnosis, or under the flu shot field, so we have the flu shot field here, we want to type in criteria false. And then we want to update the comments field. So right now we don't have a comments field, but remember, we want to create an update query. Right now I just have a query. So I can go up here to my query type now, and I can choose which type of query I want. So if I click on update, now I should have the option update to add that comment. So when I update to, I want to type in call patient to make appointment for flu shot under the comments field. So I want to make sure I'm in the cell for update to, and then we want to type in this comment. Call patient to make appointment for flu shot. Okay, so now we want to run the query. So once we've added everything and I'm going to save it, now I can run this query. And to run it, we just want to go to Results. So Query Tools, Design, Results Group, click Run. And I get this pop-up that tells me that it's going to update 211 records. And if you look in the instructions, it tells us that if we completed the steps correctly, we should update 211 records. So we just go ahead and click Yes. And now we can close this query. Okay, so step 6, we want to create a make table query from the diagnosis table to add all records for patients with a negative diagnosis to a new table. So the first thing I'm going to do on this one, I'm not going to use the wizard this time. I'm just going to do query design. And I want to select the diagnosis table. So I want to add that. And I'm going to close the Show Table menu. And from the diagnosis table, we want to include diagnosis ID. So to select our fields, we can just double click them and it'll move them down here for us. Patient ID, flu shot, and diagnosis. All right. And now it wants us to use the criteria negative for the diagnosis field. So under diagnosis, I want to type in negative. And it wants us to name this table results negative. So remember, on this one, we want to create a make table query. So first we need to select make table. And it's asking us what we want to name our table. So we want to name this table results negative. And we want to click OK. Now we want to run the query, and it tells us the query should copy 65 records to the new table. So let's click Run. And it shows us here that you're about to paste 65 rows into the new table, and that's what we want to do. So yes. And notice now we have a new table over here. We've created the new table based on this query. So this is everyone that has not had the flu shot. All right, now we can name this query. So if we click our Save As tool, we can name this query Make Table Results Negative. And we want to click OK. And then once we've done this, now we can go ahead and close this query. All right, so step 7 tells us we want to create a delete query. So again, we want to go to the Create tab, and we'll use Query Design to create our query. And we want to base this query on, we want to delete all records for patients with negative diagnosis from the diagnosis table. So we want to add all fields from the diagnosis table to the query. So we want to choose diagnosis, and then we can close this show table window. And it tells us we want to use all fields. So I'm just going to click every field. And it says to use the criteria negative for the diagnosis field. So again, I'm going to, under diagnosis, I want to type in negative. And it wants us to run the query now. So remember though, we have to make this a delete query. So first thing I'm going to click is delete. And so I've made it a delete query. And now I can click run, and it tells us that we should have 65 records that will be deleted from the diagnosis table. So remember, those 65 records are in the results negative. So we still have those results. We just don't want them in our diagnosis table. So we just click yes. Okay, so now we can save and close this query. So when we click our Save As tool, we want to name this query delete negative results records. And just be sure you're spelling it correctly, using the correct capitalization and no spaces. And then click OK. Alright, so moving on to step 8. It wants us to create a query to summarize the number of patients for each diagnosis per state. So this time it's telling us from the patients table. So let me close this, and again I'm going to create query design, and this time I'm going to choose the patients table. And if I read ahead a little bit, I can see that I'm also will be selecting some fields from the diagnosis table. So I'll choose patients table first, and I'll just go ahead and choose my diagnosis table, and now I can close this show table window, and then I can expand so I can see all the fields. And it tells us from the patients table we want to select state, and then from the diagnosis table we want to select diagnosis and flu shots. So diagnosis and flu shot. Alright, and let's see. It wants us to display the total row, and then under the flu shot field, select count. So here on the Query Tools Design tab, in the Show Hide, we can click on Totals, and it adds the total group here as the third row. And under flu shots, we want to group by count. And then it says, then it asks us to run the query, and it tells us there should be 15 records in the results. So if we click run, we should, and it'll switch us to this data sheet view. We can look down at the bottom and see that we have 15 records. All right, so we want to save this query, so we can click on Save As, and we want to call this one Flu Shots by State. Click OK, and then we can close this query. All right, so step 9 wants us to modify the under 18 query in SQL view. So we find under 18, and we can double click it to open it, and we want to switch view. This time we actually want to do it to SQL. So this is kind of the coding side view. And it wants us to modify the code, the SQL code, to display only records for patients under 18. So, you know, you have to kind of be a little bit familiar with code, and of course this class does not cover that in depth, or actually at all, except for this assignment. So one thing about code, in this very last line, notice it has a semicolon, so that's kind of identifying that that's the end. So we want to add our line, we want to add our code before the end. So I'm going to put my insertion point on the second row. At the end of the second row, I'm going to press the enter key, and then I'm just going to type it exactly as it is in the instructions. So we want to do where patient dot age greater than 18, and we want to run this query. So I'm going to click run, and I'm hoping that it will work. It tells us that there should be 18 records, so yay, we did it correctly. So we can save this query now and then go ahead and close it. All right, so now it tells us to go ahead and close the database and exit access. So I'm closing, and now you're ready to submit the project. So hopefully this helped, and if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or send me an email.